Hi everyone, this is Tholin and today we are back with a new emulation video. This time we are going to focus exclusively in one of the most common consoles of the 1990s. I'm talking of course about the Super Nintendo. This powerhouse by Nintendo that it was released back in the 90s and it took the gaming community by storm. It is one of the most successful consoles ever developed with a huge library. Of course, in this case, we are going to use RetroArch on the Retroid Pocket 2. The first step, as always, is to download the appropriate core, which in our case is the SNES 9X. So you would go, when you launch RetroArch, to download core, you would select the SNES 9X, wait a few seconds until it is downloaded and then activate it. Now, as always, we are going to also test a few games to see how well they perform, and it is a custom, we have created a custom in those videos to have a few background information regarding those games. Well, don't expect any lags, don't expect any crackling sound or anything like that. We are talking about a 16-bit console, and the Retroid Pocket 2 can handle its emulation perfectly. Now it's up to you to follow any other of my videos where I have some specific information and tips on how to improve overall performance of RetroArch and the Retroid Pocket 2. You can apply them in this case, but in most cases you will not need to do so, as the Retroid Pocket 2 can handle the Super Nintendo emulation perfectly. So after I have downloaded the core, I have loaded it, and then I had saved my configuration as I always do, and I stress that out. Always save your configuration in RetroArch. It avoids going and repeating the same steps over and over. Now the next step is to scan for games. We have already shown how you can do that. You select your directory, you select the auto scan, and the RetroArch will scan those directories for any ROMs and for any zip files or RAR files containing the ROMs. Now, after that is completed, you will find the ROMs you have downloaded available to play at the appropriate, let's say, part of RetroArch where the Super Nintendo games are shown. We are now ready to begin our testing, and we will begin alphabetically. So the first game is Aladdin, a 1993 game developed by Capcom in this case, and it was based on the animation movie that came out in theaters based on that classical, let's say, story or fairy tale. Now that 1992 movie was a big blockbuster back in the day, and there were several games. Actually, this game was ported to a big number of devices. In the case of the Super Nintendo, though, there are some differences, especially the fact that in the Super Nintendo version of the game, Aladdin is not carrying a scimitar. This follows the overall, more kid-friendly releases that Nintendo wanted to have back in the 90s. You may recall the case of Mortal Kombat, where the first Mortal Kombat was censored. There was no blood in the Super Nintendo version. They have replaced that with sweat. Now, this is a magnificently drawn 2D platformer. The sprites and the animations are all hand-drawn, and the quality is perfect. Now the levels are magnificent. The level design is excellent. You also have this little monkey that is following you around. There is a lot of platforming, a lot of enemies, different enemies, and this game can become quite challenging from time to time. That was the case of the platformers back in the day. Not everything was a walk in the park, especially when we are talking about 90s gaming, because that was the way that developers utilized in order to increase the let's say, hours you have to invest into this game. The cartridges and the floppy disks back then were their capacities were limited, so they were usually increasing the difficulty of those games in order to increase duration. Don't forget that you had to pay a sizable amount of money to get those cartridges back in the day, and there was not that a big number of piracy, especially when we were talking about consoles, not like the case that we have today. So in order for a developer to ask for a full price for this game, they have to find ways to increase their duration. Now, this is one of the gems of the Super Nintendo, especially if you are into platforming. And of course, I'm excluding any Mario or Yoshi game. We will see some of them later on. But if you want something different, if you want something that it is reminiscent of the old Disney movies, back when those Disney movies were hand-drawn and before they were replaced by computer graphics, this is a game to go. This one, along with the release of The Lion King, are two of the best Disney-based platformers of back in the day. Now, moving on, we are going to switch the genre. This time we are going to focus on an RPG, and this is one of my personal favorites. We are talking about Chrono Trigger. I cannot stress enough how I love this game. I have been following Square Enix for years now, and I've been spamming every live event asking for a remake. Unfortunately, we do not have it yet. I don't know if we are going to have it in the future, but this RPG to me showcases in an excellent way what the Super Nintendo could do and what the Japanese genre of RPGs can give you. Hours upon hours of amazing story, great characters, and in this case, great graphics. The combat is turn-based, but this game is using a system called Active Time Battle, a system that it was introduced by Square Enix in Final Fantasy IV, and it was designed by one of the main producers of the Final Fantasy series. What it does is that actually you have a timer to select your action, and that makes battle a bit more fast-paced than the typical turn-based JRPG. Now, it has a great cast of characters. Here you see the introduction. It begins as 99% of JRPGs begin. You wake up in your house. Zelda starts this way, Final Fantasy start this way. I think this is the most common theme, and I believe that in most cases the producers were using that as an inside joke nowadays. Even Earthbound or Mother starts like this. Anyway, you select your characters where you have to give them their names, and then the game starts, the story starts where you have to visit a fair. Now, what is different, especially if you compare this JRPG to Final Fantasy, is the fact that you do not have that typical random encounters with enemies out in the wild, but most of them are visible on the overworld or the map, the actual map of the game. All in all, to me this is one of the best 5 games of the system, especially if you are into RPGs. I hope that one day we may see it in a HD remake, but up to that, until that happens, I think you should invest some time in your Retroid Pocket 2 and enjoy this game. Give it a couple of minutes in the beginning, 10-15 minutes, and after that you will leave your other games that you are currently playing and you will keep returning to that. There are not a lot of games that can do that. To me, at least, there are not a lot of games like that. I would count them in one hand. Chrono Trigger is one of them. The 2 Golden Suns for the Game Boy Advance is another example of so captivating games. But don't take my word for it, just try it for a couple of minutes and you will see how well those games were made back in the 90s. Remember that these games were designed during a period of pure creativity. Those games were made because there was a story to tell, not an audience to capture as they do today. But anyway, this is an old man's ramble. So all in all, one of the best games for the Super Nintendo. Let's move on to our next. Let's go back to platformers for our third game. We have another iconic Nintendo IP that was actually developed by a British company called Rareware. We are talking, of course, about Donkey Kong Country. Now, what Rareware did, or Rare back in the day, did differently was the fact that they utilized some state-of-the-art workstations, graphics workstations, back in the 90s. Those were called the Silicon Graphics workstations. Up until that point, they were mostly used in movies and video clips, and in Hollywood, actually, in Hollywood quality productions. But what this company did was that they took those Silicon Graphics workstations, they created the graphics, the sprites, and the animations, and then they re-rendered, let's say, those graphics back to the Super Nintendo system. And I'm saying that they re-rendered because Silicon Graphics could outperform the graphical quality that Super Nintendo could, let's say, display on screen. So Rare had to downgrade those graphics. In this case, in the case of Donkey Kong Country, this is one of the best platformers, period. Aladdin was a great movie-based platformer, but this is one of the best platformers ever made. The fact that you can use two characters in most of the time, Kong and his son. In other games that followed, you could use more members of the Kong family. You could also use rhinoceros, as you can see here, other animals that could help you move past various levels. Now, what is impressive about Donkey Kong Country is the fact that it was actually developed by a team of 12 people over an 18-month period. The production period was 18 months. Nintendo purchased a minority stake back then in Rare in order for them to develop and to assist the company with more funds. They have also decided to, let's say, take the Kong franchise out of its long hiatus, and the end game was this magnificent game. Now, in the case of Retroid Pocket 2 using RetroArch, Donkey Kong Country performs without any issues, so we can now move on to our next game. We keep switching between platformers and RPGs, so this is an RPG. And we are talking one of the most unique, let's say, RPGs or games in general that came out for the Super Nintendo. This series of games was called Mother in Japan. However, it was released in the USA and the rest of the world as Earthbound. This is Earthbound, an RPG, a modern day RPG to be precise, that was out of the norm. That usually the RPGs were 90% of them were fantasy themed, and smaller, like 10%, were sci-fi, or in some cases a combination of two. But what Earthbound did differently was the fact that it was a modern day RPG. The story takes place in a modern setting, and it begins with a big explosion, let's say, during the middle of the night, which is actually a meteor that hits this small city. And then your main character begins, as he wakes up in the middle of the night, he begins by trying to find his friends that live nearby. Now, this is a party-based, turn-based, again, RPG, but the overall theme of it is more targeted towards older audiences. I mean, there are so many popular culture references and inside jokes, let's say, during the story, which is excellently written, and it develops and unfolds in an excellent way that the younger audience could not really connect to. And that is one of the reasons also that this game flew a bit under the radar back in the 90s. That was mostly due to the fact that back then console gaming was associated with younger audiences up until some very aggressive marketing by Sega, and we will see in another video some emulation focused on Sega consoles. Sega was the first to try to approach a bit of adolescents or young teenagers or older teenagers rather than younger kids as Nintendo did. So a more adult-themed game was not very popular back for the Super Nintendo. Now, this game was released in 1994 in Japan and 1995 in North America. That was the second game in the Mother series, but the first that was being translated to English. If you haven't played it, I suggest you do so, because it is an iconic RPG, especially if you like sci-fi and modern day stories. Now, moving on, we will continue with the same genre. It's another RPG, and this time is one of the most famous RPG series of all time. This is Final Fantasy III. If we want to name a series that defined the JRPG genre, it's definitely the Final Fantasy series. Now, this game is a fantasy one, but with a lot of sci-fi, let's say, inspiration also. And as you know, Final Fantasy took a different path as it progressed, taking a more sci-fi approach rather than the early fantasy theme that it utilized in its first titles. Now, that game was developed by Square back in 1990, and it was one of the biggest commercial successes both in Japan and in the rest of the world. It sold millions of copies. This game has been ported even in our days to modern systems. This series, of course, is still alive, is still going strong, and to me, this game has one of the best introductions in the Final Fantasy series, especially the part where the team is moving towards the first city and has that iconic soundtrack in the background is mesmerizing to me. I remember playing that back in the 90s, and I was resetting the game and restarting it just to hear the music. There was no YouTube, of course, back in the day, and I didn't have the actual soundtrack to enjoy it, but it is a real pleasure to go through the story of this game, enjoy its characters. As already mentioned, it is a turn-based RPG. All the Final Fantasy, more or less, up until a certain release at a certain period of time, were pure turn-based games, and this is one of the best introductions to the JRPG genre. If you are considering starting or playing a Japanese RPG, I suggest you try either this one and start with this one, or with Chrono Trigger that we saw earlier on. Of course, as in most of the cases with the Final Fantasy title, this is a party-based RPG. One of the first that uses the job system, where you can assign different jobs to members of your party and change that in order for them to have a specific role in the story, a specific role in each fight. This game shows a bit of bleeding on the side of the screen in some cases, especially in some scenes where there's a lot of scrolling, but other than that, I haven't noticed any issues with the game as far as I progressed, to be honest. That was a typical case of a random, let's say, encounter. This is how the screen pixelates and changes back to the combat scene, and this is the typical turn-based combat that you can see in most of the Final Fantasy games. Again, if you want to try a Japanese RPG, Try this one or Chrono Trigger, and believe me, you are going to enjoy them both to their fullest. We move on with a fighting game this time. This is another title developed by Rare. We are talking about Killer Instinct. Now, this game was initially released as an arcade game, and it was heavily influenced, according to the developers, by other famous fighting titles like SNK's Fatal Fury. Now, Rare, again in this case, utilized those magnificent graphics created in Silicon Graphics workstations, and those graphics performed great on the arcade environment. This is the Super Nintendo port of Killer Instinct, which again looks terrific, especially for a game released in the early 90s. And also the animations are great. There are a lot of combos. This was a very successful game. It had a sequel, Killer Instinct 2, that was ported as Killer Instinct Gold for the Nintendo 64. We have also tested it in the appropriate Nintendo 64 video. It runs without any issues. You can enjoy it, and there is no button lag, which is very important for a fighting game, as you can see while I'm testing every other button on the Retroid Pocket 2. So you can download it. It is easily to find. It's one of the let's say 3-4 best fighting games for the Super Nintendo, along with Mortal Kombat that we are going to see later on, and Street Fighter, of course, which is also iconic. Now, let's move on to our next game, which is a platformer. We are talking about Kirby's Dreamland 3. Now, this game was developed by HAL Laboratory, a company that had and still has to this day close ties to Nintendo. This was actually a platformer that was targeted towards younger audiences, but also people who were not that used to playing platformers. It had some mechanics that could help the player progress and move without being very challenging from time to time. Of course, this doesn't mean, of course, that it is an easy game. On the contrary, it can get quite challenging, and it's also a very fun game. Now, what is also important to notice here is, as Nintendo has stated, the origin of the name of the little pink character here, Kirby. Now, this character was named after the famous lawyer John Kirby, an attorney back in the day, who was mainly responsible for Nintendo winning the lawsuit it had from Universal Studios on the copyrights of the Kong franchise. Universal Studios sued Nintendo for a copyright infringement based on the fact that they had some movies with Kong, that big monster, and Nintendo creating the Donkey Kong franchise, which according to Universal Studios infringed their copyright. However, the team by Nintendo won, and that team was led by John Kirby, who is shown here. You can see the resemblance. And then Nintendo named this beautiful, bold character after this attorney. As you can see, the game runs excellently. It has no lags or no other type of problems. You can enjoy it and you can complete it. To me, the Kirby franchise is not among my favorites, but I can understand the people who love it, as it is a magnificently designed game. Now, let's move on to an iconic title of the Super Nintendo, a franchise created by Shigeru Miyamoto. I'm talking about Zelda, of course, and this is Zelda: A Link to the Past. One of the best adventures that you can find for any system. I am personally not that big Zelda fan, but I love those early 2D games, and I also love the remake that was made to Link's Awakening, which is also a 3D but follows the same perspective, let's say the isometric one. I am not a huge fan of the 3D Zelda games. like Ocarina of Time, Majora's Masks and all the later titles, and I hope that we will see some good remakes, HD remakes of the early 2D Zelda games. Now, specifically, this game is so magnificently designed, the animations are amazing, and I personally love 2D hand-drawn sprites, and this is a game that showcases this type of technology in an excellent way. Moreover, it has a great story that unfolds. It is, of course, it begins with you have to go and save the princess, but there are so many things going on, and it develops and unfolds as you progress. It also has, to me, the best designed dungeons and puzzles that you can find, especially in the early era of Zelda. This one, along with Miniscap, that was released for the Game Boy Advance, are two of my favorite Zelda games. The bosses are also excellent with good level of difficulty. Now, this game was developed by a dream team of the Nintendo led by Shigeru Miyamoto, but there were other members like Tezuka, if I'm not mistaken, that was involved, and of course it has a magnificent soundtrack created by Koji Kondo, the iconic composer of Nintendo and the man responsible for a big number of famous video game soundtracks, like the Mario theme, for instance, or the Zelda theme in our case. Again, no issues here. You can play Zelda A Link to the Past using RetroArch on your Retroid Pocket 2 without any delays or any other types of problems. And if you haven't played it, then, well, what are you waiting for? Actually, pick it up and you won't regret it. Now, moving on, we will stay on the platforming genre, but we're going to have a look at something totally different. Now, this is a sci-fi platformer, a series that is keep strong up until today, a Capcom franchise. Of course, we are talking about MegaMan, or Rockman as it is known in Japan, and this is MegaMan X3. This is an action platformer with fast-paced action, a lot of combat, and a high level of difficulty, if I'm honest. I totally suck at playing MegaMan, but of course it is a very famous franchise. This is the third of the MegaMan X games, and it is the last that was ever released on the Super Nintendo. I think that there are more than 20 MegaMan games, a lot of spin-offs. Now in later days the series seems to be losing its direction. There are a lot of flops that were released later on, but these are the early days, the mid-early days of the series. The beginning was, of course, on the Nintendo Entertainment System, but the MegaMan series really took off during the Super Nintendo era, as it could utilize the better technology to show nicer graphics, better special effects like the explosions that you see here, more weapons, more characters, bigger levels, more complexity in the level design, and all that stuff that make MegaMan one of the most famous action platforming franchises ever. As you can see, the graphics are great, and it looks like a game that was developed later on, but still it is a game that was released in the middle of the 90s. You can enjoy it, of course, on the RetroArch without any issues. So let's move on to our next game, which in our case is a fighting game, and we are talking about the famous Mortal Kombat by Midway. Of course, this was originally created for the arcades. It's one of the most successful arcade games ever, and it was developed using a new technique back in the day, which was digitizing actual actors. There is a new documentary that came out about Midway and the development especially of Mortal Kombat. It's called Insert Coin, so I suggest you have a look at it. Other than that, it's a great game, but it has this issue of censorship, as they have removed all the blood and have replaced that with sweat. That was the case only for the Super Nintendo port of the game. If you play it on a Sega Genesis or Mega Drive, it still has the blood. Of course, on the arcade, it has the blood and all the extra moves with a lot of blood and gore. It is still a great fighting game even without the blood, and you can play it on the RetroArch. Again, as you can see, no button lag or any other types of problem. You can enjoy it 100%. Moving on, we will stay on the genre and we will show the arch nemesis of Mortal Kombat, which is of course the Street Fighter series. This is Street Fighter 2. A game again developed by Capcom that came out in the arcades. It was the second installment in the Street Fighter series, but it was actually the game that let the series took off. This is the turbo version. It has 2D graphics, a totally different direction when compared to Mortal Kombat, but the graphics and the combos are excellent. There is no blood here though, but it is a game that I believe that 99% of every gamer out there have tried it or played it. This port to the Super Nintendo is a magnificent port. It has no issues, so I suggest if you want to try a couple of fighting games on your Retroid Pocket 2, try Street Fighter 2 and the Mortal Kombat that we saw earlier. Moving on, we will return to the platformer genre with an all-star game, a pure Super Mario All-Star game. This compilation has 4 iconic Mario games from the Nintendo Entertainment System era. It includes the Super Mario Bros. Of 1985, the Super Mario Brothers The Lost Levels, which is actually the Japanese Super Mario Brothers 2, the Super Mario Brothers 2 that was released in North America, which was another game that they have changed to a Mario game to adapt to a lower difficulty as it was requested by Nintendo of America, and Super Mario Bros. 3, which to me is the best Nintendo Entertainment System game ever. Of course, all these games are remade and they are using the new Super Nintendo technology. As you can see, the graphics are better compared to the Nintendo Entertainment System releases, and this is among the best platformers that you can play on the Super Nintendo and on the 16-bit era of consoles in general. If you haven't played it, stop the video and start playing those games from the Super Mario All-Stars. All 4 games performed without any issue on the RetroArch. Of course, these are 16-bit 2D hand-drawn games developed by the team led by Shigeru Miyamoto, of course, and Tezuka was involved in the development of some of those, with the music by Koji Kondo, the true Nintendo All-Star Trio. For our next game, we will remain on the Super Mario franchise, but this is a game that was developed by Square. And this is because this is Super Mario RPG, a totally different take on the Super Mario franchise, as it was a very new idea back in the day to utilize the famous squares system and type of approaching an RPG and bringing that to the universe of Super Mario, having all the Super Mario characters, the Bowser, Princess Peach, but in an RPG, and that combination was extremely successful back in the day. As you can see here in the emulation, there's some bleeding on the top of the screen, but this will not stop you from enjoying this amazing game. The battle system is turn-based, where you have to use some button pressing some good timed button pressing and all the abilities that your character has in order to progress in an isometric environment where you have to fight not random, as you can see them on the overworld monsters, and also a lot of bosses at the end of every level. As you can see, you have a number of abilities that are available and a number of weapons that you begin only with your boots. Later on you get more weapons, and you can use them in order to defeat a number of characters. There was a sequel to that game, as it was very successful, but later on Nintendo and Square didn't get along that well, so this series was renamed to Paper Mario, and it is alive up until today, as the latest release was for the Nintendo Switch with Paper Mario Origami King. The basic mechanics are still there with a lot of changes and upgrades, of course, but that was the beginning, and this game, along with the next one, which was the 1000 Door, if I remember correctly, are two of the best of the series. As you have seen, there are some issues with emulation of this game, a lot of empty blank screens and a bit of flickering, but other than that you can still play it without major issues. Moving on, I have said it in my other videos that Yoshi is one of my favorite Nintendo characters. This is Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island, another platformer where the star is the little dragon Yoshi, and it has a lot of differences with the other Super Mario games, as it has a lot of different mechanics. You're mostly utilizing Yoshi and his abilities, which is to consume, let's say, his adversaries and create eggs, and then you can use those eggs to hit some other levels, some other items in the actual stage in order to progress. I love the way these games are designed, especially those, let's say, kiddie graphics in the background, and all these visuals are very appealing to me. I love how Yoshi games look, even up until today with the new games that came out for the Switch. All those games are great, and usually the Yoshi franchise is a franchise where Nintendo feels more freedom to try new things, especially in the design department. You have seen the Yoshi, the Woolly World, where the items seem to be made out of fabric, or other Yoshi games where the whole design looks like it's made out of cardboard. So Nintendo is trying a lot of things and a lot of new things with the Yoshi series. Now, this is an excellent game that you can play in RetroArch without any problems, and believe me, you should try it. Finally, our last game is Super Metroid. Now, this game, along with Castlevania, they defined a new, let's say, mid-genre of games. For some weird reason, I have downloaded a ROM that also has German text, but anyway, that's not going to be a problem. Now, as I was saying, Castlevania and Metroid created the Metroidvania type of games, where you have a lot of exploration to do in huge, vast levels, until you reach some point that you cannot progress because you have to find a new ability, so there is a lot of backtracking, moving back and forth. Now, Super Metroid begins by recapping the events of the previous games, like the Metroid, and it is done in a very nice cinematic way, and then you begin your exploration with your major character, which in our case is Samus. Now, this is one of the most famous Nintendo franchises, and if you like the Metroidvania games, this is the game to start. You can begin, of course, with the previous games that were released in the Nintendo Entertainment System, but this game is better visually, to me at least. So, everyone, that was all for our emulation guide for the Super Nintendo on the Retroid Pocket 2. We have seen 15 different games, and I think that we have created a quite thorough guide on how and what games to play from that 16-bit Nintendo console. Of course, the 16-bit era was the era of the first console wars, so to give you a small spoiler of what our next video is going to be, we are going to focus on the big blue, which is Sega, of course, and try to see what Sega did that Nintendo don't. So thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to subscribe to the channel, thumb up, and follow us as we have more content coming soon.